So in this week's episode, I want to talk a little bit about blood sugar management. Or an alternative title for this episode would be How to Not Get Diabetes. And that's an interesting point because blood sugar management is often only talked about in connection with diabetes. And obviously here we're talking about type 2 diabetes, the kind that you get usually later in life, although now it's becoming such an epidemic that you're having small children getting it. And it's very much been associated with lifestyle factors. In particular, obviously it's been heavily associated with obesity, so there's been this kind of idea that obesity causes type 2 diabetes. Actually, it's not quite that clear cut, but they are obviously related. And it's actually interesting to note, actually, that everything that we're going to talk about in this video also applies to people suffering with type 1 diabetes. Many people who have type 1 diabetes are actually taking incredibly high levels of insulin, far higher than they would need to take from their diabetes alone. The reason being is that they are also eating all of the same foods that we're going to talk about in this episode, which are causing insulin resistance, which means they're having to take much higher doses of insulin to do the job. So whilst we're talking about type 2 diabetes here, it is worth noting that also people with type 1 diabetes would do well to listen to this as well, because it could mean that their medication could actually be reduced. So the first thing we need to understand is, how does our blood sugar work in a healthy individual? So, quick version. When we get glucose from a meal, essentially, all of our carbohydrates, whatever they may be, whatever form they take, they're going to be broken down, and predominantly we're going to end up with glucose, which is the main fuel for all of our cells. Now, some people unfortunately have a bit of a backlash against this and think glucose is bad. It is not. It is your body's primary fuel source. It is super important. Your brain in particular, really dependent on glucose. So much so that you don't actually have the insulin receptors, insulin-mediated glucose transport into brain cells. The glucose just flows right in there. That, unfortunately, of course, has caveat, is that's one of the reasons why hypoglycemia is so dangerous, because that glucose is going to go straight into your brain cells and it can damage them if we have too much of it. But that doesn't mean we don't want any. We do. Glucose is good. Okay? So that is an important point to get clear. The problem is too much glucose is bad. And that is the case with everything. Too much water can kill you, so don't, vilify something just because too much is bad for you. Now, glucose, because it is so important, when it is in your small intestine, it actually uses a method called active transport to get into your bloodstream. So in other words, you actually burn up energy to get the glucose in. So because you're actually using molecules of ATP to get that glucose in as fast as possible. It's worth sacrificing a bit of energy to get it in because of how much energy you're going to get out of the glucose. Now, as I say, brain cells it's going to flow straight into. It's also your red blood cells. Anything that needs, very urgent energy, and so on, the glucose actually goes straight into the cells. But for your other cells, they actually have a mediator to get the glucose in when it is needed. That obviously takes the form of insulin. Insulin sets off a chain reaction which opens up the cells essentially so that glucose can flow in. Now, cells can only take so much glucose, and they only want it at certain times, so that's why it has to be mediated by the hormone insulin. And we then have a transport system that follows on from that, where we store excess glucose as glycogen, and then eventually we turn it into fat and so on. But that all takes time. So in the short term, we need the insulin to drive the glucose into the cells to avoid a condition called hyperglycemia, which is where we have too much glucose in our blood. And as I say, that is very dangerous because it can start damaging brain cells and so on. Now, you might be thinking that if hyperglycemia, i.e. too much glucose in the blood, is a problem, then the root cause of that problem is eating too much sugar. Now, it's not the case that sugar doesn't matter. Obviously, that is a factor in it. If you are constantly drinking things like a can of Coke, for example, if you look at how much, actual sugar is in that, it is alarming. It's far more than the 4 grams of glucose that you should have in your entire body at any given time, i.e. circulating in your blood. So yes, we do have a problem with incredibly sugary foods like that. Because they've been stripped of anything else, like a sugary drink is a classic example, there's nothing in it but sugar. So, what that leads to is a problem, because we do end up with blood sugar. It basically, look at the blood sugar chart, you're going to go see a little thing like this. It's going to be... And what's happening there is obviously your blood sugar is shooting up incredibly fast because all that glucose is being driven into you, and that's so unnatural. That would never happen. You're eating fruit, you're eating a whole load of fibre, and it's worth pointing out as well that most of the sugar that you get in fruit is fructose. Now, fructose is entirely different because remember how we mentioned that glucose is taken by active transport out of your small intestine? Fructose is not. Fructose essentially uses a process, it's a bit like osmosis if you studied that in science. When your blood sugar is low, it draws the fructose across that barrier. Fructose, therefore, cannot spike your blood sugar. It's not possible. If your blood sugar is constantly too high, the fructose is just going to sit in your small intestine, and eventually you're going to get diarrhea, by the way. That's why you don't eat loads and loads of fruit at one time. Just, little tip. But you're eating that, in a healthy diet, absolutely fine. Cannot spike your blood sugar, so do not run away with the idea that fruit causes diabetes. It does not. It cannot. That did unfortunately lead some very silly people to develop high fructose corn syrup, which is an artificial, evil. Never ever eat anything with that in. That is terrible for your blood sugar, please. But that's nothing to do with fruit. So remember, fructose, good. High fructose corn syrup, bad. Okay. Little tip that could save your life. Anyway, since fruit and nuts and seeds and all that is our natural diet, well, naturally, we only ever got a nice, steady stream of glucose, so the system worked fine. When we drink something like a horrible fizzy drink sort of thing, that much sugar suddenly going into your system is not natural, and your body gets panicked. And yes, artificial sweeteners will do the same thing as well, so sugar-free, your body doesn't care, it's going to do the same thing. And what's going to happen is all that sugar is going to rush in, and your body obviously panics. It can't cope with that much sugar, so it produces lots and lots of insulin, and it has to produce it really, really fast. You're going to get incredibly high levels of insulin, which is going to drive all that sugar out, get it into the cells, but then of course your blood sugar plummets. And that is why if you eat a lot of sugary things and you have a real binge on sugary things, you will probably find that very soon afterwards you will crash and your energy will drop and you will feel crotchety and bad-tempered, you struggle with concentration, you can often get memory issues, and that's because your brain is now deprived of glucose because it's all been driven into the cells. What that probably leads you to do is go and eat another donut, and you get the same problem, and that, goes up and down. That does not do anyone any good, it's not good for anyone's mood, obviously, it's not great for anything. However, this is the important point, that alone is not really the leading cause of the type 2 diabetes, because your insulin is doing its job, okay? It's not great for your health, and it's not great for your health for many, many reasons. It's also, then ultimately that has been put on as fat, it's going to have terrible effect on your weight and so on. But the real leading cause of ultimately type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance, and what is happening there is that your insulin is being produced, as we said, so you spiked your blood sugar, all the insulin is produced, but it's not working. That glucose is still circulating in your blood and it is not going into your cells. And the reason it can't get into your cells is because that insulin is supposed to set off that chain reaction, and then the glucose goes into the cell. Well, that's not working. Now, there have been all sorts of studies into this, and many learned scientific journals have published articles that strongly indicate it is not sugar that is causing that insulin resistance. It is in fact fat, particularly saturated fat. So, if you are eating a diet that is high in saturated fat, what is happening, that saturated fat is actually blocking the action of an enzyme which is necessary for the insulin to work. So that all that insulin is being produced, but the glucose is still in your bloodstream. Now, what tends to happen is your body just produces more and more insulin. And so, interestingly, if you were to, have a blood sugar test early on in this, it probably wouldn't even show up because your body will just produce more and more insulin and eventually it will compensate and it will get that glucose into the cells. But it can't keep doing that forever. So, unfortunately, the first you know about it is when you go to the doctor and they tell you that you've got diabetes. Now, that can still be corrected through a healthier diet, but it's far better to do it before you get it. It's the old adage that prevention is better than cure, and that is just a fact. So, yes, we do want to cut out those horrible sugary drinks. If you are drinking them, then you absolutely need to make a commitment to yourself not to. And if you do need, any help and support with, any dietary changes that you want to make, as ever, do visit my website. I have lots of resources on there that can help you, and you can always get in touch with me there. So yes, sugary drinks are bad. Eating donuts, definitely not good. All of these things are true. However, if it is an occasional treat to yourself, you have a big cake on your birthday, if your insulin is functioning as it should be, then that is okay. So, whilst we do not want to be overindulging on processed sugars for many, many reasons, they are not the main issue. The main issue is overall, is your diet full of saturated fat? Because if it is, then those sugary, foods are going to cause a serious issue, and the end result is going to be diabetes. And as ever, you will be surprised to hear that the solution to the problem does come back to a whole foods, plant-based diet. Because the more of your diet that fits that description, the less saturated fat that you are going to be consuming. And processed sugar into the boot. So you get a double whammy of health. You also are likely to experience far more energy and a much better mood overall. This has been reported by so many people who have switched to this diet, which means you're less likely to go out and suddenly indulge in that bag of donuts anyway. You will not get the spikes of blood sugar. And the end result obviously will be health, harmony and happiness, which is what we are always aiming for. So I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and as ever, if you have any questions, do please get in touch. There is a link to my website. That's the place to go. And I will see you in the next episode.